to John chapter 21.
Yes, ma'am.
I was listening to Wednesday nights, I think.
All right.
Anyway, it quit before it was over.
Oh, okay. That's because I was long-winded that night.
And what do you mean? It doesn't.
It has a 45-minute limit, and so it cuts off after 45 minutes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So if you do listen to a recording and it cuts out, it's because it hit a 45-minute limit. And so I had a way to circumvent that, but the way to circumvent it is it takes forever to get done. And so I'm trying to figure out another way to circumvent that so that it shows the full thing. But I got an idea. It's just hard to implement because I got to do a little. I got to trick the system. So.
I just wanted to work into that. I didn't know if you knew it or not, and I thought I was just going to let you know.
Yeah, that's the bad part about that recording system is it does only go 45 minutes. There is a way to go around it, but I've got to rig it up, and I'm working on it though. I'm also trying to work up a way to hear y'all's comments more. So.
I heard you say that.
Good.
A lot of people from your meeting said that they wanted to listen.
Yeah, that's right.
It's true. I can hear pretty much, but then again, I know the voices too, so I'm familiar with, and I can make it out so that maybe somebody who doesn't know everybody.
Sure. Right. Well,
Makes a difference.
we'll get it ironed out eventually.
Oh, yeah.
Just a reminder, the classes we've talked about wanting to do will start here in the next couple of weeks. The dates are up there on the board for that. August the 12th for both Old Testament characters and an overview of the minor prophets. And then the big one that you asked for, Revelation, on July 25th, Wednesday. And I said that you want to bring a 3-ring binder because Ashley's working with me on getting a way to print those notes out so that you can keep up with all the notes that I'm going to make for you in a 3-ring binder. You could even get dividers, and I might be able to provide notes for the other two as well. But we've got to figure out the printing situation first before we do that. So, okay. Does anybody have any Bible questions before we get started this morning?
I have a question.
All right.
Is there any way, since I can't come on Wednesday night, is there any way that I'll give you a binder and I just want to make sure that
Yeah, I can email you the notes, and you can print them out and put them in the binder if you want to.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I'm going to do for some people that want it that way. But those who want it on paper can get a binder, or you can just keep it on your computer. Whichever way you want to go.
Okay.
So
long as I can print it out or I can get that, that's good.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else have any questions or Bible questions? All right, we're in John chapter 21 then. We covered John 20 last week, and we saw some of the first few post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And now we're close to the end, one chapter left in John, before we're able to switch gears here. So let's start in John 21 and begin reading in verse 1. He says, "After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And he manifested himself in this way. Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee and the sons of Zebedee and 2 other of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, 'I'm going fishing.' And they said to him, 'We will come with you.' And they went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing." Now some people have speculated about this passage, and they've said that Peter and all these men that are with him were discouraged by the events that taken place, and so now they're going to turn back to their old career of fishing. But I don't see that that's really the case. I mean, they have just seen Jesus 2 times in a row, once on the day of his resurrection and another time 8 days later, as you saw at the end of chapter 20. And so it seems to me that they're doing what they usually do, and trying to make a living. Kind of like Paul when he went out and made tents. And so this seems to be the case here, but you might have your minor disagreements upon that point. But it's interesting to note that they fished all night and they caught no fishes. We had a song that we used to sing when I was in. Do you know that song, Zelda?
No, I know you just say fishes. That's my grandbaby. That's not.
Well, I'm about to tell you why I sing that. I said that because in the song that we sing Peter, James, and John in the sailboat, and they fished all night, but they caught no fishes. And so we have a lot of verses to add on to that too. But that's why I say fishes as a reference to that song. Johnny?
Right, you were saying what some people may speculate that passage because they went fishing.
Right.
A lot of times fishing is relaxing. You know, a lot of times things on your mind, things that are bothering you, what bothering them, it may have been because of his Christ, him back again, so they know it, but they still distraught somewhat. So, fishing it's relaxing. It relaxes your mind. So I think this is the reason they would be all night, because it's a place to relax. I've gone fishing and left home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it may be 7 o'clock the next morning. I come home and catch nothing,
Right.
I just pay a leave and going to work. I'm going home, and with nothing, it's relaxing. Someone said that it's relaxing because it put a person's mind back to before they were born, when they was in their mother's womb. They were surrounded by water.
That's interesting.
It's relaxing.
That's interesting.
Back in that state where you can really relax.
Not to mention that you get to spend time in nature. And any time you get to survey God's creation is definitely an eye-opening and a humbling experience. Lonnie?
I think it's not only that, it's anything that to take your mind off the thing.
Right.
You should be doing something you like to do, take your mind off what have been going on. That's relaxing. To do something you always like to do or go somewhere. That take your mind off of it. Especially them at this time, all the situation they've been going through up until the death and all of this.
Yep, that's right. That's good. All right, anybody else have any thoughts on that? All right, let's look at verse 4. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know it was Jesus. They are, if you read down a few verses, they're about 100 yards away. And so it's interesting, but they did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" And they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll find a catch." So they cast, and they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. How about that? This might go into what we were talking about last week in verses 30 and 31 of John 20. This is just another one of those signs that Jesus showed to his disciples after his resurrection to prove to them, that it was really him, that he truly had conquered the grave, conquered death. He truly did accomplish what he meant to do on the cross, and that this was all part of God's plan. And so, as the song goes, they fished all night, they caught no fishes. Here comes Jesus walking on the seashore, cast your nets on the other side, and now their nets are full of fishes. And so here they have this great number of fish. They can't even haul it into the boat. Now Johnny talked about him going and fishing all night, but he probably didn't have this part happen to him, where he's getting ready to go back in and he, casts out his line and he catches, 3 fish on one hook. But that's kind of what they're doing here. Miss Joyce?
I just want to say back when they didn't catch no fish, but I remember I went to fishing with Joe one time. That was my first time on fishing, and they stayed down there all day. And when that does start, they moved to another spot. And every time I put my pole out there, I would catch a fish then.
Wow.
I caught 35.
Whoa.
And they say, "That's give us a look." I said, but he didn't even catch it that day, but I caught 35.
Wow. Whatever you're putting on that hook, they like that. When I think about this great number of fish, my granddad had 2 ponds, or he had 3 ponds, but he only stocked 2 of them. And one time we had to drain one of the ponds. And we drained the pond, and when the water gets, about knee deep, we had this huge net that we took it all the way across the pond, and you had to get all the fish out. And we just walked with that net across the pond. And it was, as he said, full of fishes. And that, it was just one of the steps we had to do to keep that pond maintained. But that's what I think of when I think of this. I can't imagine getting all those fish up into that boat like they would have had to have do eventually. Get all these fish back up on land. That must have been a lot of work. And we see in verse 8 they're actually going to be dragging these fish behind the boat. Okay, so in verse 7 we see that this sign proves something to one of the disciples. Therefore the disciples whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. What are your thoughts on verse 7? Some people use this see the way that the fishermen dressed, from what I understand, is that they had a vest that they wore, and then the outer garment. And so Peter he didn't have all of his clothes off. He had on this vest, and so he gets his clothes all the way on, and now he throws himself into the sea. Why do you suspect that he did that? Why do you think he threw himself into the sea?
Embarrassed.
He could have been embarrassed. That's one way to look at it. What else?
I've always seen Peter as kind of like one of the impulsive disciples. He'll just hurry up and do something, like when Jesus said, "Come walk on the water." He was like, "Okay," and he gets in the water. Or here he sees Jesus. He's like, "Okay, I'm going to hurry and go see Jesus," or something like that. He just always seemed like he was just really excited and wanted to throw himself in and go see Jesus.
Yep, and we see that in verse 8, the other disciples, they come in a little boat. And so he impulsively, gets on his outer garment. He wanted to be presentable, as Granddaddy, Mr. Cash, pointed out. He wanted to be presentable, and so he puts on his outer garment, he throws himself into the sea, and he's going to go out to meet Jesus. The other disciples, though, they came in a little boat. They were a little bit more patient than old Peter was. For they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. I never thought about that. Peter got out of having to drag that net. He told him, he said, "Well, you drag the net, I'm going to go see the Lord." So when they got on land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." And Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land. There he goes. He gets his fair share in. He drew the net to land full of large fish, 153. Now, Joyce, you had 35, but 153, you're pretty close to getting the Lord's catch there. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. So you really have multiple miracles going on here. You've got the miracle of the catching of the fish, and you got the miracle of this net not tearing despite it being way over its load. You may have gone fishing before and, trying to catch a fish, but you end up catching some kind of turtle. Snapping turtle is really bad up where we live. And a lot of the times the weight of that turtle, it'll break the line. Or if you get caught on a log, that'll also break the line too. But I dare say that none of us here have ever done something like that, right? None of us have ever done that. But they dragged this net up on the line. They dragged this net up on the line. They dragged this net up on the land, and the net was not torn. And so Jesus tells them in verse 12, he says to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to question him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. That's just so interesting to me that as we talked about a little bit on Wednesday night, it seems if Jesus is somehow changing his form here in some way, making himself in some way unrecognizable, and yet they didn't question that it was the Lord here in verse 12. So Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This is now the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Anybody got any comments on 12? Yes, ma'am, Miss Connie.
Well, I'm just wondering, is there any significance in the fact that they saw a fire of coals, fish laid on it, and bread? Where did that come from?
Well, he could have,
Did Jesus?
he could have gotten it from anywhere. He could have gotten it from the market. He could have gotten it from the sea.
When they started, somebody had already started a fire, and that's what I'm talking about. It says here that and as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there.
Well, I'm sure Jesus.
Laid on it and bread. I just wondered if somebody else was out there fishing and already had fish caught and they were eating.
You always took that just to mean that Jesus had already prepared himself a little breakfast, and he told them, "Come add your fish to the fire," and you have some breakfast as well, right? That could be it.
Well, I thought it was interesting that Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish," and Peter just brought the whole net, all 153 of them. He could have just went out and got like a few, but he was like, "No, I'll bring the whole thing."
Well, I guess he had to bring it up on the land to get some of them out without letting them all go.
That was kind of silly sounding.
Yeah.
So by now, Jesus can get all these fish at one time just by casting the net. And, Peter see that. Why not just bring all the fish and cook them all at one time? And you have to go and cook.
Well, I remember. You know the account whenever they had to pay their tax, right? And Peter caught that fish and there was a gold coin in its mouth. I tried doing that last tax season. I caught so many fish and didn't get any gold coins. Okay, let's see. Verse 15. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my lambs, tend my sheep." He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." He said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." Finally, in verse 17, he said to him a third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." Does anybody know the secret? There's a little secret that goes along with this passage about the Greek language that you don't see in the English. Does anybody know what it is?
Can we ask, like, do you love me as a friend, or do you love, and then the next time you ask, do you love me as a brother?
Well, that's right. The first two times that Jesus asks Simon, he says, "Do you love me?" He uses a Greek word, agape love. And the third time that he asks, though, he says, phileo. Do you phileo me? Which is more of a brotherly kind of love. So here, to agape someone is to love them in more of a social or a moral sense, kind of like what Laura suggested. But phileo is more of a brotherly love type of thing. And so he switches up this word, he switches from agape to phileo on the third time. But Peter did admit that he loved Jesus every time. However, when you look at the, let's see, the internet's being slow this morning. When you look at the words in verse 15, let me read it to you like this. "Simon, son of Jonah, do you agape me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you." So he says, do you love me? And he says, "I have brotherly love for you." In verse 16 again, he says, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And again he says, "I've got this brotherly love for you." And then finally Jesus says in verse 17, do you have this brotherly love for me? And Simon says, "Yes, you know all things. You know that I have brotherly love for you." So it's interesting that Peter, he did not answer back, "I agape you." He only said phileo all three times, which is a different kind of love. It's still love, it's just a different kind of love. Why do you think Peter did that? I mean, you can't know for sure, but why do you think?
There's one thing you look at, he asked him 3 times, maybe Peter might was getting a little deterred with it or something. But he said, you know that I do, because you know everything. So that might be, he kept asking the same question over and over, maybe tired.
That could be the case. He could.
You keep asking me this, what's the point,
Right.
There's got to be something behind it. You keep asking me the same thing.
Well,
That reminds me too of Peter when it all was telling him he's going to betray him.
that's it. That's exactly right. Jesus is giving Peter a second chance. Remember, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. And so here 3 times he's given an opportunity to say, "I love you, I love you, I love you." And he's letting him know, you're going to have to tend to my sheep. When the going gets tough, you can't leave. You can't deny me and run off. You've got to stay in this and tend to my sheep. Now, it is interesting that there's 2 different Greek words used here, but it's probably best for us not to read too much into that and just know that they're synonyms. And we talk like that. We talk like that too sometimes. You might ask me, "Are you afraid?" I might say, "I'm scared to death." 2 different words, but they mean basically the same thing. And so we probably shouldn't read too much into the difference in words here, but it is an interesting note to pick up on. That the first 2 times Jesus says agape, while Peter says phileo, and then finally in verse 17, they both say phileo. But all 3 times he tells them, tend to my sheep, tend to my lambs, shepherd my sheep. The idea here is that Peter is going to have to stick with the flock. He can't run off and allow the flock to get devoured by wolves. So that's a very good point, Miss Joyce. Okay, any other comments there? Verses 15 through 17? Okay, verse 18 then. Let's keep going. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now this, he said, verse 9. See, we don't have to interpret this. John does it for us. Now this, he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Now here, think about this. What was the very first thing that Jesus ever told Peter? Way back in the first few chapters of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Follow me. So that again, he's going back again, and he's reestablishing Peter. Peter had fallen off. He had fallen away. He had denied the Lord 3 times. And here he has him say, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Instead of do you deny me? Do you deny me? Do you deny me? And now he says, follow me. It's indicating to him, okay, you profess this love, stick with me now. And think about this. Jesus had just done so many amazing things in their presence. He'd conquered death. He had conquered the grave. He had done all these miracles in their presence that weren't even listed by John. And yet, he still had to show his disciples, okay, look, you've shown that I can do this. You've shown that I can make you more than a conqueror, so follow me. Now, Peter has just heard that he's going to have to die, and he's going to have to glorify God through that death. And so, here we see in verse 20, Peter turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? So Peter says, well, I'm going to have to die. What about John? And Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. And I think people read way too much into this passage, personally. I take this to simply mean, Peter, if I want John to remain here all the days of his life, if I want him to remain here, forever and ever and ever, what's that to you? Don't worry about what I've got planned for John. You just worry about what I've got planned for you. You're going to have to die this death. You don't worry about John, you worry about Peter. Now, what we do know, though, and I have a different opinion on the Apostle John than a lot of people do. A lot of people think that John lived until he was very, very, very old in the later years of Domitian's reign, and way, way, way late into the 90s and even to the early 100s. There's even a story about John getting on a horseback and chasing this apostate down with a switch. So there's a lot of stories that people have come up with about John. But do you remember what the conversation that they had between John's mother, John and James, and the sons of Zebedee and Jesus? This was an interesting occurrence because what did Zebedee's wife ask Jesus? That's right. When you come in your kingdom, who's going? Can one sit on your left and one sit on your right? Talking about her 2 sons. Let's see. Yeah, John and James. I'm trying to get that passage for you here. Let's see. That is Matthew 20:22. Let's go take a look at it real quick. Matthew chapter 20 and verse 22. So here's how Jesus responds to them. He says, Jesus answered, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? They said to him, we are able. He said to them, my cup you shall drink. My cup you shall drink. But to sit on my right hand and on my left, This is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. Now, what was the cup that Jesus would have to drink?
Yeah.
Death. And so this was a cup of suffering. He would die a death as an innocent man. Now, we know how James, John's brother, drank this cup. How did he drink the cup? Right, he was beheaded by Herod, right?
Right.
Okay, and then that was whenever Herod, he thought, man, the Jews like this, and so he tried to go get Peter, and then he got devoured. But was it worms, right? In the book of Acts.
Yeah, right.
So here we know how Jesus drank that cup through death. We know how James drank that cup through having to die a death because of his faith, same as Jesus. And so here's my question: why is John not the same way? Why wouldn't John also have to die a martyr's death? See, church tradition says that John died of natural causes. But the people that are commenting on this are commenting on it, years and years and years after John had died. And there's a common tradition, for instance, that Peter was hung upside down on a cross in Rome, and he was a bishop in Rome. Well, we have just as much as much reason to trust the Catholic sources that say that Peter was a pope in Rome, that as we do to trust the same sources that suggest that John died at an old age of natural causes way into his life. Let me show you a passage that Paul gave us in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. And I think this just puts the nail in the coffin in terms of this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul talks here about the apostles. And he is, let's see, First Corinthians. What did I say, 1 Corinthians? Okay, good. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Paul has this, why can I not find it? It's gone. Let's see. 1 Corinthians, oh, there it is. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 9. Notice what he says. For I think God has exhibited us apostles, he's not leaving really anybody out there, last of all, as men condemned to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. I think it's interesting that Paul says that the apostles were condemned to death. They're condemned to death for their faith. And yet we have John living over 100 years old somewhere in Ephesus. But again, there, you can take any position you want to on that, really. It's not that big of a deal, but that's just something that I picked up on and thought I'd suggest to you as an option. Now, there's one group that thinks that John is still alive today. Do you know who that group is?
Mormon.
The Mormons. Yeah, that's right. The Mormons. I was talking to the Mormons about the coming of the kingdom. We all understand the coming of the kingdom on the day of Pentecost. And we were talking about Mark 9, verse 1, which says that some of you standing here will not taste of death till you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Or see the kingdom coming with power and great glory, whatever the exact wording there is. And I said, so you don't believe the kingdom has come? And they said, oh, no, not all the apostles are dead. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, they take this literally here in John chapter 1 that we just read. Or not John chapter 1, but John chapter 21, what we just read. They believe that what Jesus is literally saying here is that John would remain until the coming of the Lord, until the coming of the kingdom and things like that. And so the Mormons say, they reason, well, since obviously the kingdom's not here, John must still be alive. But I think the most natural way to take this passage in verse 22 of John 21 is Jesus is telling Peter, don't worry about John, you worry about yourself. All right? And as I've suggested to you, I think John died of persecution later on in his life. Okay, verse 23. Therefore the saying went out among the brethren. Now this is exactly what the Mormons are teaching, but notice what he says. Therefore the saying went out among the brethren that the disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come. What is that to you? He didn't say that he would. He just said if he wanted to, Peter, that's not a big deal to you. You worry about yourself. I'll worry about, John worries about himself, and I'll watch over all of you regardless. Okay. Finally, we get to verses 24 and 25. And he says, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. That's a lot to think about. That we have a song that I mentioned the other night. That if the oceans were filled with ink and the sky was parchment, you would dry up the sea and fill up the sky with all the words about God's love for us. And that's basically what John is saying here. It's a hyperbole, of course. 3.5 years. You could write down 3.5 years worth of words that somebody said. That's a lot of words, but you could write down all those words and it wouldn't fill up the entire world. It's a hyperbole. He's just saying Jesus has done so many amazing things, I can't fit him in a 21-chapter book, which he didn't have chapters anyways. Okay, let's go to Luke chapter 24 now, because I know we're done with John, but this is a parallel gospel study. We're just kind of using John as our anchor here. And let's take a look at the Great Commission. Luke 24, and we're going to begin reading in verse 36. Luke 24 and verse 36. We're kind of rewinding the clock here, back about a week from this last occurrence we just saw, but this is still within the same time frame. Okay, verse 36. We've already basically covered something like this, but Scripture says, while they were telling these things, he himself stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be to you." But they were startled and frightened and thought they were seeing a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet? That it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they could still not believe it because of their joy and amazement, he said to them, "Have you anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it before them. What is the significance, you think, of eating this fish in front of them?
It was not a spirit.
Right, he wasn't a ghost. They think they're seeing a ghost. And, they're about to, who are you going to call? Ghostbusters. But see, so Jesus proves to them that he's not a ghost. He's him. He truly has risen. He truly has conquered Hades, etc., etc. And now he stands before them. Okay, verse 44. Now he said to them, "These are my words which I spoke to you." So I've told you this was going to happen while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Let's note this for a moment. I'm going to ask you a quiz. I'm going to quiz you here. All right. Here it says that I spoke this to you, so that all things written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms about me must be fulfilled. Take a real quick look at Joel chapter 2. I mean, not at Joel chapter 2. I'm getting ahead of myself. Look at Acts chapter 2 for a second. Now, let me ask you a question. Now, in Acts chapter 2 and verse 15 and 16, Peter says, "For these men are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only the third hour of the day. But this is that which was spoken of through the prophet Joel." Now, in other words, what Joel prophesied about in Joel chapter 2, 28 and following, Peter says is coming fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, about this pouring out of the Holy Spirit. All right, so here's a question. Jesus said, all things written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms about me were fulfilled through his death, burial, and resurrection. So how is there still other stuff to be fulfilled in the Old Testament after his death, burial, and resurrection? The answer is in 2 words.
Some prophecy, this was fulfilled until then. That Job had prophesied, about the young men and the young women to be prophesied. That had been fulfilled. What was written of the Lord had been.
That's it. That's the distinction. And that's why I said 2 words, because he makes a distinction there that's about me. He wasn't talking about Pentecost and things like that, the pouring out of the Holy Spirit, the great persecution that they would face from their brethren, all those things that we know that are prophesied about in the Old Testament. He was talking about specifically prophecies that had to do with him, his death, burial, and resurrection, and things like that. So he's basically just telling them here in Luke 24 I've told you this was going to happen. I told you this was to fulfill prophecy, so you should have expected it. Notice it's in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. He covered all of his bases. Everything from Genesis to Malachi contains things that are about Jesus, about his life. There's a great preacher that you might know, you might not know him, named James Hopkins, and he did basically a survey of the entire Old Testament and showed Jesus in every book. In Genesis, he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, Genesis 49 and verse 9 and 10. In Exodus, he's typified as the Passover lamb. In Leviticus as well, you have that sacrificial system that was a shadow of Jesus and the sacrifice that he would make. In Numbers, he's shown as the captain of the Lord's host, and you can go on and on. In Deuteronomy, he's a prophet like Moses, and you can go through the whole Old Testament and see Jesus, either a prophecy about him or a type or a shadow about him, all through the Old Testament. And so what Jesus is saying is everything that you've seen happen is in accordance with the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. I'm a fulfillment of those things. In fact, notice the order of this. He says the law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms. This is because in their Old Testament, it was ordered differently than the Old Testament that we have. Their Old Testament went from Genesis to 2 Chronicles because it was structured in the law, the prophets, and then the Psalms included what we typically think of, Psalms, Proverbs, things like that, as well as the histories. And it went Genesis to 2 Chronicles. In fact, look at Matthew chapter 23 for a moment, and I'll show you another example of this. In Matthew 23, Jesus tells the Pharisees and the scribes, he's talking about them, he's talking about how they were going to reject the people he was going to send, and how their fathers had rejected the people before. He tells them in we'll read verses 34 to 36. He says, "Therefore, behold, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you'll kill and crucify. Some of them you'll scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." Now, Abel, first person we see in the Bible to die a physical death, and that in Genesis chapter 4. And he not only was his death a physical one, but it was one that was because of his faith and because of his righteousness. And so from Abel, from Genesis, to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. Now, do you know where that's found? 2 Chronicles 24:21. So from the beginning to the end, from the beginning of their Old Testament to the end of their New Testament, they would be guilty of all this blood shed upon the earth. Okay, let's go back to Luke 24 now, and let's continue on. That's just another way that the law, prophets, and Psalms is laid out in Scripture. Genesis to 2 Chronicles. All right, verse 45. I wish we had more details about this verse. It's so brief, but I wish we could I wish we could know more about what he tells them in this 40-day period. Then he opened their mind to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Christ would suffer and rise again from the dead the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. And behold, I am sending forth the promise of my Father upon you, but you're to stay in the city until you're clothed with power from on high." So here we have the Great Commission being given, at least a version of it. It's given as well in Acts chapter 1, and then, of course, in Mark, as well as in Matthew. And he, again, just tells them, he says, this is what the Scriptures predicted, and this is what's come true. And now you're going to have to be a witness of this and go and talk about this to all nations, starting with Jerusalem. All right, finally, here we come to verse 50 through 53. "And he led them out as far as Bethany, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. While he was blessing them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they, after worshiping him, returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple, praising God." I've pointed this out to you before, but to me this is so interesting what he does here. He lifts up his hands and he blesses them. What have I told you before that the significance of that is? Yeah, that's exactly right. Look in Hebrews chapter 9 for me for an example of this. In Hebrews chapter 9, you have a discussion of the Day of Atonement and how Jesus would fulfill that Day of Atonement. And it says here in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 24, "For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." So when Jesus ascended into heaven, that was a fulfillment of what that priest used to do. It was a type that what the priest used to do in blessing the people and then going into the holy place on the Day of Atonement was fulfilled in a type and shadow form in Jesus, in his ascension into heaven, to appear in the presence of God on behalf of everyone that would, on behalf of the people. And so here in Luke 24:50 and 51, we see that he is blessing them as he goes into heaven, just to point out the role is Jesus as the high priest. It's a really interesting study you can do on that. All right, finally, verses 52 and 53, and then we'll break before worship. "And they, after worshiping him, returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple praising God." Well, they did that for about 10 days. And then, of course, we know what happens on the day of Pentecost, right? And then, of course, they went into the temple, and they used They went into the temple and used that situation as an opportunity to preach the gospel. And they also did the same thing with synagogues all over the known world, all throughout the Roman Empire, meeting in synagogues, teaching people about the gospel of Christ. You think that we could take that as an example and go into places where people are religiously minded and take that as an opportunity to teach them the gospel? I know, for instance, that I've sometimes tell a friend, "Hey, if I go visit your Bible class, will you come visit mine?" And I've done that in the past, and it usually works. And sometimes they'll come for several weeks. Sometimes they don't. I know we've had a couple of baptisms in the past based off that kind of idea, that structure that I've been somewhat involved in, where we've invited a friend to church and he ended up being baptized, a couple months later. And so, it's a good idea to go and talk to people who are religiously minded. That's why I don't get too upset around Christmas and Easter time. We have Christmas and Easter where we know that they're not commanded in the Bible or holidays that we should follow. But during those times of the year in particular, people are thinking about things about the gospel. And that's a great opportunity to strike up a conversation. That's when that rule, don't talk about religion and politics, fades away for a day. And you can openly talk about your faith to somebody and ask them what they think about what Jesus did on the cross, and there you have a good conversation to have. But I think we could take that as an example and focus on people that are religiously minded and use that as an opportunity to teach them the truth about the Scriptures. But all right, that's all for today. Does anybody have any questions or comments to close it off? Okay, we'll take a quick break.